right, thanks for joining us. We're really excited to be back here for another presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about women and women's history. So when it comes to housework, or maybe lawns in Orange City, nobody notices it unless you don't do it. Or maybe you've heard this one, nobody sees clean windows. So the historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, she published an article in the American Quarterly, spring of 1976, entitled Virtuous Women Found, New England Ministerial Literature, 1688 to 1735. Woo. And I'm going to quote her from that article. Cotton Mather called them the hidden ones. They never preached or sat in a deacon's bench, nor did they vote or attend Harvard. Neither, because they were virtuous women, did they question God or the magistrates. They prayed secretly. They read through the Bible at least once a year and went to hear the minister preach, even when it snowed. Hoping for an eternal crown, they never asked to be remembered on earth, and they haven't been. Well-behaved women seldom make history. End quote. So that's where this phrase came from, and it kind of took off. Maybe you've seen it on bumper stickers or t-shirts. It's in my office on a little plaque that I found at Home Goods. So it's even made it that far. And the journalist Kay Mills used it in her informal history of women called From Pocahontas to Power Suits, and she changed the word seldom to rarely. So sometimes you see well-behaved women rarely make history. But this is what Ulrich says. My objective was not to lament the oppression of women, but to give them a history. She's interested in recovering the lives of obscure women, much like Sarah and I do, and that we're going to do tonight. So Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is, she's a historian of colonial history. She's at Harvard University. I love this picture of her with Benjamin Franklin reading his Philadelphia Gazette there. She's got a good sense of humor, spending all of her time in colonial history, trying to find the women. But I wanted to give a little overview of the discipline of women's history and some of the inherent struggles and problems with that. Then I'll talk a little bit about the typical experience for a lot of pioneer women, and then Sarah will talk about how sort of atypical that experience was for the women around here, and then some of the connections between the two. So in the 1960s, from the women's movement, we have the emergence of women's studies or women's history. Not that women weren't in history before the 1960s, but we see a resurgence of people, and particularly women, who are interested in learning more about them. And so the general overview of the profession, or of the field of women's history, is that it starts by focusing on the great women, the leaders, the interesting people that sort of stand out, followed by an examination of regular women. What did regular people do? Not the leaders, not the exciting ones, but the regular people, which is what Sarah and I are looking at, regular women. Then we see an expanded definition of who counts as a regular person. Initially, we see mostly white middle-class women enter the historical record because it's harder to find other examples, but we see a growing body of literature studying Chicano women, studying Native women, studying African American women, studying immigrant women, Chinese, Japanese, and we see a focus on women of different classes, so working class women, women's experiences in unions or as domestic workers. And then finally, starting around the 1980s, we start to see the field look at gender as a category of analysis, so more of a theoretical framework that looks at the construction of gender from how masculinity and ideas of femininity are defined in a certain society. So we're not going to do the theory part. We're going to stick with the stories of the regular women tonight. But I wanted to start by doing something with you all. I'm curious if you can take a few minutes with maybe the people you came with or the people around you. This is a smart bunch, I know. And I want you to come up with the top 10 list of women that are significant in American history, excluding first ladies. So take a few minutes, come up with some names. I'm curious what you'll come up with. Some of those written. Yeah. All right, what did you guys come up with? Yeah. Sacagawea, good. Anybody else? Susan B. Anthony, very popular, good. Rosa Parks, excellent. Ida B. Wells, Burnett, very good. Harriet Tubman, good. Jane Addams. Laura Ingalls, oh, that's a good one, yeah. What's that? Amelia Earhart, that's a good one. How about some more recent ones?
Julia Ward Howe.
Oh, excellent. Oprah, excellent. She makes a lot of top 10 lists that students write, which is always interesting. I also had a student include Marilyn Monroe, which made me chuckle. Influential and significant, right? Can mean lots of different things. Good.
Condoleezza Rice.
Condoleezza Rice, good. Corrie ten Boom, yeah, that's a good example. Was that difficult to come up with 10? I know a few people are usually like, oh, but Eleanor Roosevelt and Abigail Adams, right, as first ladies. Yeah, it's interesting because we know that women have been roughly half the population for all of U.S. history, and yet sometimes it's still a struggle to come up with some, although maybe the more time you spend at talks at the museum or reading history, that becomes easier to find some of these names, which is exciting. So I want to go back to what the historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich said, and she says this: "The well-behaved women, quote, works because it plays into long-standing stereotypes about the invisibility and the innate decorum of the female sex. Many people think women are less visible in history than men because their bodies impel them to nurture. Their job is to bind the wounds, stir the soup, or serve the ale, as Sarah will tell us, and bear the children of those whose mission it is to fight wars, rule nations, and define the cosmos. Not all those who make this argument consider women unimportant. On the contrary, they often revere the contributions of women as wives, mothers, and caregivers, or at least they say so. But they also assume that domestic roles haven't changed much over the centuries, and that women who perform them have no history. If women occupy the fixed center of life, and if history is seen as a linear progression of public events, a changing panorama of wars and kingdoms, then only those who, through outrageous behavior, divine intervention, or sheer genius, step into the stream of public consequence have a history. The problem with this argument is not only that it limits women, it also limits history. Good historians are concerned not only with famous people and public events, but with broad transformations in human behavior, things like falling death rates, or transatlantic migration, or migrations from Pella. Here, seemingly small actions by large numbers of people can bring about profound change. It's not just leaders, right? It's regular people getting together and doing things too. But this approach runs up against another imperative of history: our reliance on written sources. Until recent times, most women, and a great many men, were illiterate. As a consequence, their activities are recorded, if at all, in other people's writing. And this causes a lot of problems. So for example, Sarah uses a lot of obituaries to find out about these women. But you don't usually write your own obituary, right? Other people write about it, and they filter that in a particular lens, usually to talk about you in a nice way, and maybe gloss over some of the less great parts of your life or personality, right? Or maybe not. That tells us something too, right? So people who cause trouble usually show up in court records, like our bootleggers that we talked about a couple of years ago, or in newspapers, or in their master's diaries. But those who quietly went about their lives are either forgotten, seen at a distance, or idealized into anonymity. And even today, publicity tends to favor those who make or break laws. So we have a source problem, right? That it's hard to find information on women unless they are notorious or they've done something that's unusual. So Sarah and I are working to change that. And a lot of other historians have been working on that as well. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these regular women and what they're doing in the frontier. So for pioneer women in the late 19th century, westward expansion imposed frontier conditions. So a lot of them, as time progressed, we have some industrialization in the East. You can start to buy things like your clothes and your soap. Things get a little bit easier. There's not as much household work. But when you move out to the prairie, things get a little harder. I think nothing says welcome to the prairie like emptiness and a wheelbarrow of buffalo chips. Yes. Nothing. You can see nothing, right? It's hard to imagine. I think this captures it, and her expression captures it as well, right? So it expanded or it imposed these frontier conditions, which people weren't necessarily used to, prolonged the family labor system, extended the life of household production, and raised the demand for female labor, paid and unpaid, and most of it was unpaid. Pioneer women combined household work with farm work. They did some income-based labor by trading and selling, and all of this is ignored by the census. This isn't sort of recognized as work that women did. But household labor, it incorporates a lot. Things like cleaning with the dirt floor, that must be fun. Cooking, baking, washing, including laundry, which requires something to make a fire, probably buffalo chips, boiling water in huge vats, physically moving that, and actually scrubbing the material, right? Finding a place to hang it, exhausting. Canning, processing meat. Oh, I spent an awful afternoon in graduate school reading detailed accounts of slaughtering hogs and all the work that went into that, which is exhausting just to read. They made dairy products, they made soap, they kept bees, made their own beeswax, well, used the beeswax the bees made. Made candles, many of them did garment production, spinning, weaving, sewing, knitting, and even dyeing some of the fabric. All of us today would say, I think those all sound like individual businesses. And yes, they all are, right? So it's a lot of household labor. Susan LaFleche in 1888 said this she said, women know how to do, quote, everything that a man does beside her own work, end quote. Because if men were unavailable, the work still needed to be done. And what we see is that for many frontier women, those gender roles break down a little bit when you're in survival mode. Nobody really cares about whose job it is to feed what or harvest what. You just do it, right? And so they jumped in and they just did it. They tended animals, they raised gardens, they drove reapers, they drove harvesters and hay wagons. Some worked alongside their men, sometimes instead of their men if they were injured or if they died or they were out of town. In Montana, many of them ran ranches and drove cattle to market. Let's see. So there was one widow, she was a migrant to Wyoming, and she filed for land under the Homestead Act in 1909, and she said this, I'm very enthusiastic about women homesteading. It really requires less strength and labor than it does to wash. Whatever is raised is the homesteader's own, and there's not house rent to pay. It's a pretty good deal. So for many women, this is what their lives were like. For many women on the frontier, life was very isolated and lonely because initially there weren't very many people, and you didn't get to see a lot of people. And those winters are long, and they get pretty dark and lonely. So that's more typical, and as Sarah will talk about, that's actually not as typical for many of the women that came to Orange City because they did more of a familial migration and had more members of their family all come together. So this is more typical, and what happens in Orange City is a little less typical. There are some women who earn wages, but far fewer. They do this through trade. Some were missionaries and teachers. Some were boarding house keepers, as Sarah talks about. Some were cooks or seamstresses or laundresses. And a few were entertainers or prostitutes. So maybe that'll be our next talk. But I also want to talk about some of the other women that might be typically overlooked. We also have Hispanic women on the frontier. Mexico declares independence from Spain in 1821 and establishes its own republic. And in the late 1840s, the U.S. claims land in New Mexico and Arizona, modern day California and Texas. And what we see is that a lot of the Latinas had a wide variety of paid occupations, actually a lot more than the white women did, earning pay as bakers and weavers and vendors and craft women, as farmers and ranchers, and ran their own businesses. Many of them owned property separate from their husbands, had access to court where they could sue or be sued, which is pretty important if you own a business. And as actually more Americans filter in, they lose a lot of their independence within the Hispanic community as they sort of start to model more of their gender roles on white gender roles. We also see for a lot of Native American women that they're involuntary migrants, most of them dispossessed of their land and a disruption of their life and customs. And we also see a shift for a lot of the gender roles of the Native women, depending on their different tribe. But for example, in 1842, for Choctaw women who married white men, they became ineligible for their land claims. The Cherokee Constitution enfranchised only men. And what we see is that as there's more and more tribes that are pushed onto the reservations in Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, and South Dakota, we start to see them doing more things like homesteading and farming. We see mining and ranching as well. And these roles shift from more traditional roles of procuring and producing food to doing a lot of domestic labor, often in white households. And so we see sort of this imposition of private property and individualism, where they lose a lot of their traditional activities and become much more economically dependent on husbands. However, they don't just accept all of this, and in some ways where I'm standing is this perfect illustration of that, is that one of the ways that they sort of fight back against all of this is through their production of crafts that maintains their identity and their cultural heritage, and it's something that they pass down generationally, and it's beautiful as we see around us. And in its own weird way, there's a big market for it amongst the white people who are putting them on the reservations, right? There's still this recognition of their culture and traditions. And so that is actually one of the ways that they make themselves economically viable, is through the trade and selling of their traditional beadwork or blankets or turquoise or whatever it ends up being. So that's just a little bit of an overview of what the typical frontier is like. And now Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about what Orange City frontier is like.
This iconic photograph, well, at least it's iconic for those of us who are interested in Sioux County history, was titled the Jubilee Photograph of 1895. To celebrate the 25th anniversary of Orange City and Alton, these four men rode at the head of the parade in the same spring wagon, using the same mules that took them on that famous first journey. These men, Hendrik van der Waal, Sjoerd A. Sitma, Jelle Pelmolder, and Hubert Molenberg, had the distinction of making up the investigative team from Pella, Iowa, who set out in April of 1869 to find land for a new Dutch settlement. 3 summers ago, I presented Settling Orange City, a new colony, and I talked about these 4 men and celebrated the venerable Henry Hospers, who pushed for the establishment of this area. I celebrated their story of the settling of Sioux County. But now I want to talk about the people who are missing from the picture. What about the women? What about these men's wives? Should they too be a part of the settling of Orange City, a new colony? What about the well-behaved Dutch American women who played a role in the development of this region? What are their histories and their stories? So while these men were important in establishing a new settlement, within those first 253 pioneers in 40 family households leaving Pella in 5 wagon caravans for the 19-day plus trip to Sioux County in 1870 were wives and mothers. How did Sioux County pioneer women suffer, endure, and achieve in their homes? As Rebecca talked about, doing women's history can be a difficult task. There are few primary documents available written by women from Sioux County during pioneer days. Much of the history is pieced together from reading what men deemed important to mention about women in their memoirs, from scanning the newspapers, and especially reading obituaries. So, using these sources, I pulled together various stories about 6 women from the early history of this region. And in doing so, I hope I can add to the overall story of Sioux County. And now, let me introduce to you the women who can be celebrated as well as these men. Henry was 7 years old when his parents immigrated with the original settlers to Pella in 1847. Ellen was 6 years old when her parents immigrated to America in 1854. In 1867, she married Henry at the age of 20. According to Henry, the decision to migrate to Sioux County was mutual. He wrote, "After renting land for 2 years and giving a third of my crop for rent, I couldn't get a place of my own, for land around Pella was high. My wife and I made our minds to have a sale and to move to northwestern Iowa and take a homestead." For this young couple, their mutual decision was made within a larger extended family. Ellen's father and her 6 brothers and sisters were among the initial settlers to Sioux County, and most of them remained here until their deaths. Henry's only sister and her husband also moved to Orange City in 1871. So Ellen's experiences on the frontier was not one of isolation, but rather was familial in nature. And this is a very common theme for Sioux County Dutch pioneers. Ellen was pregnant with her 2nd child when the Vander Waals moved by covered wagon to Orange City. I think it sounds terrible to be pregnant during a 19-day plus trip on a covered wagon. And she was credited to giving birth to the first child, Jacoba, in the new colony. Interestingly, Jacoba's obituary in 1961 clarified this claim, saying she was the first white baby girl born in Sioux County. In her obituary, Ellen was described as a devoted member of the First Reformed Church, and Ellen's family was devoted to her. When Henry passed away in 1928, a single woman, Marie Beloit, kept house for Ellen for 4 years, possibly even living with her. When she had to return to Morris to care for her own mother, Henry and Ellen's son and his wife moved into the parental home to take care of her. In the 19th century, it was common for children to take care of their aging parents. In August of 1927, Orange City formed a committee to develop building a home suitably named the Pioneer Home, because the first residents would have been the original pioneers to Sioux County. Interestingly, Landsmere Ridge Retirement Community and Prairie Ridge Care Facility are located on the property once owned by Henry and Ellen Vander Waal. And a picture of the couple hangs in the activity room of Landsmere. Throughout her life, the community held Ellen in high regard. Her obituary was located on the first page of the Alton Democrat with a large, bolded title, "Pioneer of the County is Summoned." Her obituary stated, not only as one of the very earliest settlers of the county, coming in the vanguard of the thousands who followed later, Mrs. Vanderwaa was noted for her devotion to family and friends. Her passing, this is a little dramatic, leaving a void in the family and community circle that can never be filled. Sjoerd A. Sitma and his first wife, Yanchi, set sail for America 1 month after they wed. They were among the original pioneers to Pella in 1847. Sitma wrote letters home which were published in the Netherlands and helped encourage other Dutch men and women come to America. It is interesting to note that these letters were also signed with Yanchi's name. Yanchi passed away in Pella, leaving Sjoerd a widower. It was his second wife who moved with him to Sioux County, and I don't have a picture of her. So I'm so sorry. Plus, I'm going to use her American name instead of trying to pronounce Dutch because I'm very cowardly with pronouncing Dutch names. So in 1855, Bertha, along with her first husband, immigrated to America. This union produced 3 children. Within 2 years after arrival, her husband died. In frontier days, there was economic peril in being a single parent. For widows, the situation was often dire, for there were very few economic ways for women to earn a living. Many widows are listed in De Volksvriend, our local Dutch paper, as paupers. And Orange City actually had a poor farm for people in financial straits to live. Therefore, it was economically advantageous for men and women to remarry, and sometimes it happened very quickly after the death of a spouse. On October 13, 1857, Sjoerd and Bertha wed, and she was 18 years younger than her groom. I couldn't find a date for when Bertha's first husband died, but online I found one family genealogist who added this helpful comment that he died sometime before October 13. By this time, Sjoerd was a prosperous farmer, and he bought and sold land extensively. The couple had 7 children combined before marriage, and were blessed with 6 more. I say the same thing. Bertha was a midwife in the local community. She had a lot of experience with babies, right? Throughout history, midwifery was an acceptable healthcare occupation for women. In a story recounted in The Story of Sioux County, written by Charles Dyke, Bertha bravely endured a fierce snowstorm to aid in the birth of a child of Johanna and Tunis Molenberg. On a winter day, Tunis's brother Jacob was sent to Bertha's shanty about a mile away to escort her back to aid in the birth. As Jacob and Bertha made their way back on horseback, a fierce snowstorm struck, severely limiting their visibility. Jacob made the decision to drop the reins and let the horses use their instincts to guide them back. The horses slowly wallowed through the deep snow when they heard the familiar sound of a family dog. They discovered they were nearly on top of the little stable, half buried in the snowdrifts. As there was a clothesline stretched between the stable and the shanty, they got a hold of that, and it guided them to the entrance of the home. Fortunately, the half-frozen woman, Bertha, was soon thawed out. The baby was born, and all were well and happy in the little shanty on the prairie. On July 12, 1884, Bertha died at the age of 54 from dropsy. Dropsy is an obsolete medical term, but at one time it was used to describe an abnormal accumulation of fluids in the body. A fatal condition, dropsy was probably the result of an underlying disease of heart, liver, or kidneys, which really narrows down the diagnosis. Her obituary stated, "The deceased was a consistent Christian lady and died with the full assurance of blessed immortality." Additionally, Mrs. Sipma was well known and universally respected by the people of this vicinity. A large number of them attended her funeral. Interestingly, Sjoerd was not done. He got married for the third time in his 80s, so good job. Yeah, we can't get over that one, can we? His third wife, actually, when he died, got remarried too for the third time. So that's a complicated lineage. Jelle Pelmolder was the first from Pella to initiate the idea of establishing a new Dutch settlement in the western region of Iowa. Jelle and his wife, Trintje, along with their 5 children, immigrated to Pella, Iowa in June of 1855. Uncle Jelle, as he was affectionately known, wrote in his travelogue that both he and his wife had an inner urge to leave the fatherland and cross over to the United States in order to seek an improved existence and a better future for their children. He continued, "And when the decision was made, we were unflinching in our resolve." Trintje suffered from severe sickness in the long transatlantic voyage. Immigrant vessels were not like the cruise ships we know today. Women had to prepare food for their own family, and Trintje was so ill that she couldn't perform this role. Fortunately, the oldest daughter could stand up like a sailor, and she took care of all the meals for the family. Trintje longed for the end of the voyage. In addition to seasickness, she had such severe back troubles that she was unable to walk with assistance. After 5 weeks at sea, she finally started to feel better. The couple, along with their 6 daughters and 2 sons, lived only 14 years in Pella before the couple uprooted again and moved to Orange City in 1870. Trintje was now 49 years old. Their first home was a dugout built into the gentle slope of the land on their farm 4.5 miles north of here. Despite sod walls and no access to HGTV, Trintje's domestic skills must have been admirable because this home was described as being livable. There were pictures and books and music. The family was quick to erect a more permanent structure, a wooden dwelling. In spring 1882, smallpox struck the county. One local history book claimed that the smallpox was brought into the community by an individual worker on the railroad. But an individual from Alton, who actually managed the railroad, wrote the Iowa Board of Health blaming an Orange City doctor for misdiagnosing the Haverkamp family as having the chickenpox instead of the smallpox, and allowing them to run all around town infecting people with the smallpox. The epidemic was so severe that neighboring towns placed armed guards at their border, and no one from Orange City was allowed to enter. Red quarantine flags flew on the gates of homes infected with the smallpox. The local school and the Reformed Church closed their doors for a few weeks because of the epidemic. Although the smallpox vaccine was developed in 1796, Dutch Calvinists opposed the vaccination as they thought it thwarted the power of God. Trintje, the well-beloved, capable mother, was stricken and soon died from the disease on June 1. The date that she died, the local paper printed 6 deaths that prior week of people dying from smallpox. The following week, the local paper printed her obituary stating, Mrs. Perlmutter was a member of the Reformed Church and showed by her consistent daily life that she indeed was a Christian. Her virtues were of a character to endear her to all with whom she came in contact. She was an affectionate wife, a kind and loving mother, a good neighbor, a friend to the poor, always ready to help those in need. Hubert Molenberg and his family embarked upon a 52-day voyage from the Netherlands in 1848. Cora was a 24, I know, I think she was happier than that. At the time, she was a 24-year-old mother of a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. Well, that's That's later in life. You'll understand why she looks like that. She had 12 kids, that's why. Like most Dutch immigrants, the Molenbergs immigrated with extended family and friends. Chain migration is the process by which friends and family from one particular town follow each other to the next town or the next destination. Cora made the journey with Hubert's parents and his 6 unmarried siblings. The Molenberg clan arrived in the port in New Orleans and traveled up the Mississippi first to live in St. Louis for 2 years. On June 12, 1849, Cora gave birth to a boy, Jacob, during the Great Cholera epidemic. While Jacob lived, the next month the couple lost their second born from the fever. The epidemic reached its peak between April and August of that summer and wiped out nearly 10% of that city's population. The family then lived briefly in Keokuk, Iowa, before moving to Pella in 1850. While some of Hubert's siblings were among the first settlers to Orange City, Hubert and Cora waited until 1872 to make the move. She was now 49 years old, and this will also help explain the picture. When she immigrated from the Netherlands, her oldest child was 3. When she migrated to Orange City 24 years later, her youngest child was 4. So all we can say is, bless her heart, right? They had 12 children, 2 though died in infancy. Large families were typical of Dutch families in America, and it was also the reason why there's so many people in Northwest Iowa related to the Molenbergs. I see some Molenbergs over there. Cora Molenberg died at the age of 74. The headline to her obituary was, "An excellent woman gone," and described her as a noble woman, an excellent neighbor, and a helpful friend, and she was held in the highest esteem. Oh, I forgot to put her name up. Her name was Klazina, but I called her Cora because I can't say her name very well. Okay. While Henry Hospers is considered to be the father of the colony, his wife was not given that distinction of being the mother of the colony. Instead, Grietje Wiersma Venema Meiskens was given that distinction and bore that name until she died. She was the cook for the 60 Pella men who left in September of 1869 to stake their claims on the farmland. She was only 26 years old and had immigrated from Friesland 2 years before. She was the first white woman to set foot in Sioux County. And when she died in 1921, her obituary claimed her splendid edibles allowed the men to keep up their courage. Now, among the new businesses erected in the burgeoning town of Orange City was a general store, a blacksmith, post office, shoe store, and a barber shop, all operated by men. However, a woman, affectionately referred to as Mother Mao, ran the local boarding house. Johanna Margaretha Peters Mao demonstrated immense pluck in the face of adversity and truly is one of the more interesting and entertaining characters in early Orange City history. Johanna immigrated to America a couple months after her husband and oldest son immigrated to America. The family had 7 children, and they were very poor, leaving all their possessions in the Netherlands. Like many immigrant families, they most likely needed to work their way across the country to get to their final destination. While the family was in Pennsylvania, the men found work. Ben, the son, worked for the railroad, and her husband, Cornelius, toiled in a coal mine. Cornelius met a tragic death when he was trampled by the lead horse on a loaded coal cart. The family then had moved to Michigan, working in lumber camps before moving to Orange City in 1871. As we talked about, there were very few employment opportunities available to women. Mother Mao began a boarding house, also described as an inn or a tavern. Included in her business was a stable for the horses and a yard where settlers could unhitch and tie their teams to the wagon if the stable was full. Mother Mao and her establishment was the cause of many rich stories here in Orange City history. The most daring Calliope raid started at her boarding house. The raid was organized by the Hollanders of Sioux County who were disgruntled by the corruption in the county seat of say the word. Thank you. I practiced that one and I knew it wasn't going to come out, which is now Hayward in Iowa. The Dutchman, perhaps slightly inebriated, took a bobsled to steal the county records and safe, and Mother Mao's son, Ben, he was involved in this bold escapade. Another time, Mother Mao almost perished in a blizzard. As the proprietor of the inn, she checked on the status of the horses in the barn in the evening. In the winter, she had one of those lines leading from the inn to the barn so she wouldn't get lost. But during one particularly bad blizzard, she had 24 horses in a barn that was only supposed to hold 10. So she took her lamp and went to walk the 60 feet to the barn. Boarders became concerned when she didn't return, and a group of men went outside calling her name. After an hour of searching, they finally found her only 75 feet away, and her fingers, ears, and toes were completely frozen. Mother Mao also served jail time. Her great-granddaughter wrote, "In those days, whiskey, wine, and beer were sold. In addition, her daughters also served coffee and food. But it was not a rough house, although drinks were served. Mother Mao watched her patrons with an eagle eye and always carried a big stick for reinforcement. And as long as guests behaved, she responded peacefully, because she wanted everyone to have a fun and good time. But she did not hesitate to throw them out the door if they became unruly." But you see, this goes along with what Rebecca and I talked about a couple years ago. The government enacted stricter laws about alcohol consumption, and regulations were enforced in local saloons. Orange City lost one of the saloon, leaving 2 saloons in Mao's Tavern. Think about that. There were 4 drinking establishments in Orange City's early history. It's hard to believe that now, but the local officials tried to get Mao to pay a liquor license fee, but she ignored the summons and continued with her business. Authorities did not want to arrest her, so they sent Elder Albert Youngward from the Reformed Church to talk to her about this matter. Her great-granddaughter wrote, "Great-grandmother received Elder Youngward in a kindly manner and asked him to be seated. She then sat down in her rocking chair facing the elder, assuming they would have an agreeable theological discussion. For great-grandmother was an avid reader of the Bible and was well-versed in the Holy Writ. The elder began in much earnest and concern, and began blinking his eyes and making other uneasy gestures as he extorted the evils resulting from the use of alcoholic beverages, especially among young people. After much expostulation on the subject, great-grandmother stopped rocking, stomped the floor with her foot and her stick, and said, "Ye Pharisee, scribe, and hypocrite, you sit there blinking your eyes and grunt and groan like a sow in heat. Ye hypocrite, get out of my house, or I'll hit you over the snout with my stick." The elder left as quickly as his dignity would allow. Since she did not comply with the local officials, they had no choice but to arrest her for refusing to pay her liquor license. She begged the officer to allow her to take her feather bed, her dog, and most importantly, her Bible. They loaded her goods on a wagon and took her to jail for 30 days. Now, this did not sit well with the community because they had witnessed Mother Mao feed the hungry and help those out who were unable to pay for their board. And after 1 week, officials enlisted the help of Uncle Yella Pelmolder to convince her to abide by the law. When Yella stepped into the jail, Mother Mao was sitting on her feather bed with her Bible in her lap and her little dog by her side. And Pelmolder told her in a friendly and firm manner that she was in the wrong. But the people of Orange City were sorry she was in jail. She could go home if she paid her fine and promised not to sell liquor. Mother Mao pretended to read her Bible with tears welling in her eyes and finally responded with a trembling voice, "I promise." Mother Mao passed away at the age of 71 years after living in Orange City for 13 years. At her death, family reported that she found great consolation that the Lord accepted strayed sheep. So, as we contemplate our city and its over 150 years of existence, let us not forget to remember the stories of the women that toiled on the farms, in their homes, and in their community. Let's bring them from the corner and bring them to the front and center of history. Their names may not be mentioned in history books about the area, nor may they be remembered outside of their families, but their stories, too, are a part of the fabric of Orange City. So I hope when you see the Jubilee photograph, you think of Ellen and Bertha and Trinche and Cora. And I hope when you see the picture of Henry Hospers, you will think about Grici and Johanna. For well-behaved women should make history.
We're happy to take questions if you would like to ask some.
Any questions?
Do you know precisely where the tavern was that Mother Mao?
No, I don't know precisely.
So asking where the precise location of the tavern was. It's a good
Do
question.
you know?
I think,
Okay.
well, I think it was in Nassau County, just across from south of Powell. 1 mile south and 2 miles west on the corner, which was also the stagecoach route from Sioux City up northward.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure the tavern was located.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
You'll have to write that down for
Yeah.
us, maybe. That would be terrific for my records.
I think that's the suspicion. Supposedly Jesse James stayed there one night.
Okay.
That may be myth.
Yes.
So-
That's in, Charlie Dykes have that too.
There's a
Yeah.
lot of myth in Charlie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's saying that the tavern was likely on the stagecoach
Route.
route between Sioux City and
Northward.
north.
Northward, all the
Yeah.
way to the Minnesota line.
Okay. Yeah.
And beyond. But,
So you used obituaries. Sounds like you used some family histories as well. I'm interested, where did you get your sources?
Yes. So Jennifer's asking about sources. Yes.
Well, the sources are hard, right? So really, I always kind of, oops. I think I talk loud enough, but I always started with the obituaries, right? And then Ancestry.com, and then there are a lot, like this Mother Mao's family did publish a lot about these stories, and they were also related to Jelle Pelmolder, so that's kind of why I think we had both those stories. Charlie Dyke does talk about Mother Mao, but he uses a different name. So they protect her stories with a pseudonym in those, and so that's kind of how I started. And then she is mentioned in some of like Nelson Noonheis's book, just one little mention, that kind of thing. So you do kind of have to work at it, and of course, the women aren't very three-dimensional. You're just kind of trying to bring the stories to life. And their names, oh my goodness, names were horrible. And it's not easy, yeah. And then also, it's like they use the same name over and over and over. Like, name your children different names because I can't tell who's who. And then there's so many of the same, obviously, there's tons of Molenbergs because all the Molenbergs came, and there's a lot of Maos. And she was the hardest one for me to dig and dig. And then, you just piece through by looking through other newspapers if they mention something, and yeah. So, and what I do know that Charlie Dyke's book is filled with some elaborate stories, but the difference between his book and the traditional histories of Sioux County is when a historian is writing about Sioux County, they do tend to mention the men, like the occupations of the men and the this and the that. And so you hardly, get a sentence here or a sentence there. But because Charlie Dyke is talking to people, then he's including women in the stories because they're part of the stories of this area. So he is entertaining to read. May not be perfectly accurate because Dutch people did like to tell stories. Yeah. Yes.
Now that most women and men living here learn to read and to write, has the situation changed? Would I expect somebody 50 years from now looking at Sioux County history from 2020 to find good stories about the women and their work as well as the men?
I would hope so.
Yes, but I do think we can continue to work on that. There is some fabulous, right now, I am just really learning Sioux County history, and so I feel like my knowledge is starting, especially in the early days, so I'm becoming more conversant up to like the 1920s, but I haven't done much past that, right? And our history hasn't ended. So we have some other great women to tell their stories too, and we need just to keep doing it. And that's part of what we try to do here at the museum. We want to keep adding to the story. So we actually, if you have a picture of Bertha, it would be great not to have her tombstone. So if you have family stories and family pictures and things like that, those are the stories that we're interested in learning about. So we can understand more people's stories, because obviously we all have a story to tell.
I told you you'd like this. Well, I have one more treat for you tonight, and it's a special treat. I'd like to introduce to you Brian Beltman, And Brian's visiting us tonight. It's kind of a special thing for us. Some of you native Orange Cityans may remember that Brian was the youngest son of William and Alice Beltman. He was born in Orange City and raised on a farm south of town. He received his BA from Northwestern College in 1967, his MA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And at that time, his studies were interrupted by military duty. He went to Vietnam and served in artillery in the 101st Air Mobile Division. After that, he completed studies at the University of Wisconsin, earning his PhD. He taught full-time at Dartmouth College, Arizona State University, and the University of South Carolina. In 1980, he changed careers and worked in the energy industry as a regulatory specialist. He continued teaching at USC as an adjunct professor for 3 decades. Brian wrote several books on Dutch immigration, including Dutch Farmer in the Missouri Valley, Dutch Transplanters on the Grasslands, and The Fruits of Chain Migration, to name a few. He has also other publications in professional journals. His writing discussed Dutch settlement in Marion and Sioux counties in Iowa and Douglas and Bonham counties in South Dakota. And I'd just like us to welcome Brian now, and he's going to say just a few words about his continuing work. Brian?
Okay. Well, this is an extremely hard act to follow. These women did an excellent job. This is my second book. There's only 2. This is my. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Is that better? Okay. Okay. This is the book. It's entitled Dutch Transplanters on the Grasslands and the Fruit of Chain Migration. And as Sarah mentioned, the process of chain migration was always at work in the immigration process from the old world to the new world. And I got interested in the process of chain migration some years ago and finally decided to make a study of that through the Dutch people. So that's how this book originated. It follows the process of leaving the Netherlands in the 1840s, and I explain the various motivations that lay behind that immigration under the leadership of several Dutch clergymen, but in our case, looking specifically at the role of Hendrik Scholte. And of course, he took some 900 people to Pella in 1847, and then there was a second group in 1849, and those 2 groups became the core settlement in Marion County. So I traced that process of movement into Marion County in the late 1840s, described the very precise way in which that took place and how the people took up the land. Then I look in the next chapter at the maturation process that took place in Marion County as Pella grew and as the colony, as they referred to it, expanded beyond the reaches of northern Marion County and a couple adjacent counties. Now, I should mention that in doing this research, I ran across the fact that there were 2 core families that were involved in this migration process. And interestingly, over time, one was the Vandermeer family, and the other was the Van den Bosch family. And those 2 family groups and their kinfolk and neighbors ultimately migrated out of Marion County to Sioux County. They were really the core group that moved to Sioux County. But I have to back up here a minute and provide an interlude to that, because this same group, this family clan, I guess is a nice way to put it, resisted volunteering for the Civil War. There were a number of people in Pella as the Civil War broke out in the 1860s who volunteered very patriotically to fight for the Northern cause. Probably somewhere around 150 young men from the Dutch community in Marion County went into the service and served in the Civil War. But the Vandermeer and Vandenbos family were pacifists. And so they and their close neighbors decided that they would not involve themselves in the war. And the only way to do that, because of the conscription efforts on the part of the Lincoln presidency, which was a necessity at that time in order to get manpower, these two families uprooted themselves from Marion County and journeyed to Oregon on the Oregon Trail. And except for a few historians, nobody knows about that. But I was able to put that whole story together, and that forms chapter 3 in the book, about this caravan of about 130 people moving from Marion County all the way to Oregon on the Oregon Trail, living there for 5 years until the war is over, and then they return to Marion County because they experienced some severe hardships in Oregon, which they had difficulty coping with, and so they returned to Marion County in 1869. They were barely there but a couple weeks or months. They got word that a group was going to leave Marion County and move to Sioux County, and so they joined that group. And again, that group of Vandermeer and Vandenbos form a significant minority of those that settled in Sioux County in 1870 and 1871. Now, that moves the book into chapter 4 and 5, I guess it is, that focuses exclusively on the story of settlement in Sioux County. As part of that, if I can find the page, what I was able to put together with the help of some reliable sources was a list of the Dutch pioneers of 1870. And through my research, I have a definitive list, as far as things can be definitive, of the 74 households that settled in Sioux County in the spring of 1870. I found out precisely what the age of the head of the household was, what precise section they settled in Sioux County, where they came from originally in the Netherlands, and what year they emigrated out of the Netherlands. It took me 2 years to build that chart. Not working 8 hours a day, of course, at it, but nevertheless, it was extremely tedious at times to do that. I had to deal with a lot of manuscript sources and the like. But anyway, those two chapters then deal with the settlement in Sioux County. In 1882, the year of the smallpox, again, a number of people in Sioux County decided that it was time to migrate one more time. Who was part of that migration? But the Vandermeer and the Vandenbos clan. And they moved from Sioux County to Douglas County, South Dakota. In 1882, about 3,000 people left Sioux County to settle let me correct that. About 3,000 people moved to Douglas County. They did not all come exclusively from Sioux County. But nonetheless, in the 4 western townships of Douglas County, a new Dutch enclave was formed. And so I deal with the settlement there in Douglas County in the 1880s and into the 1890s. Of course, in Sioux County, they had years of hardship in the middle years of the decade because of the grasshopper plague. In Douglas County, South Dakota, likewise, they had some real tough going in the very late 1880s and into the early 1890s because of drought and terrible crop production and the like. So life was very difficult there in Douglas County for a number of those Dutch settlers. A significant number of those Dutch settlers did not stay there permanently in Douglas County. Some of them moved back into Sioux County or into other places further east in Iowa and some up into Minnesota. A few of them moved on all the way to the West Coast into the state of Washington. So anyway, that in a nutshell is kind of the historical sequence that I deal with, and it is constantly illustrating this process of chain migration, because it's all bound up in familiar migration with relatives and neighbors, all knowing each other, all providing mutual support to each other, and making a success and literally surviving in the process. The very last two chapters of the book provide biographical sketches. The one is of, I can't remember all the initials to his name, Mr. Blumendahl, E.J.G. Blumendahl, who settled here near Hospers. And there's a chapter on his immigration story, his very personal story. And then the very last chapter of the book is of the Eringa family, which is my grandparents and grandmother. Of course, they briefly settled in Sioux County, but then they moved on to Bonham County. So there's two very, very, very personal stories at the very end of the book to simply personalize the larger picture of the migration process. So that's the book, and I'd sure like some people to buy it. I'm not making any money on it, or well, just a wee bit, but I won't get into the details there. Yes, ma'am.
When you talk about Douglas County, are the communities there that you refer to, would that be Corsica and Harrison?
It's Harrison, that's correct. It's Harrison. Corsica got started in 1905, I think it was. Maybe it was still in the 1890s. But Corsica was on the extreme eastern edge of those four western townships. Let me get the precise. Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to be able to find it real fast. Yeah, okay. The four west, okay, if you can see that, that's the shape of Douglas County in South Dakota. And the Dutch settled exclusively in these four western townships. They're way on the western edge of Douglas County. And the 1890 census, the land was completely occupied by Dutch. There was hardly anybody of any other ethnic background. Yeah, but
what other communities make that up now?
Pardon?
What other communities in South?
Well, I don't know. I haven't been there for a long.
And Platte?
Platte, I think, is a little bit further west in the next county, if my memory serves me correct. But the original communities in Douglas County that the Dutch started were, see, this map is so small I can't even read it anymore. Was Harrison and a place called Joubert, which was named after a Dutch general during the Boer War. Let's see, Harris. Okay, there were the little hamlets were Harrison, New Holland, Grandview, and Joubert. Those were the four little villages that the Dutch used as service centers. Yeah, but then Corsica was formed just a little bit later. Yeah. Thank you very much. To give you my plug here for selling the book, I just want to inform you that the book is available on Amazon. It's available in paperback, and it's available as an ebook, and I have some copies of the advertisement that is available on the internet at Amazon.com. And so if anybody wants a copy of that, you're certainly welcome to pick that up. But you can find it at Amazon.com. It's under my name, or, yes, ma'am? The full title is Dutch Transplanters on the Grasslands and the Fruits of Chain Migration. And I might add that the book was a finalist for the Iowa State Historical Society for the Benjamin F. Schamberg Award in 2020. Yeah. So, okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Sarah and Rebecca. I'm just going to close briefly with what's coming up next time. On September 21 at 6:30, we invite you to our 4th Nights at the Museum. The presentation will be Tulips on Parade. Bill Kalsbeck will feature events leading to the first Tulip Festival in 1936 through the 30s and 40s. We want to thank you also for supporting the museum. Your contributions have helped us to make improvements to the museum and also that we can have additional programs here. Now, one other thing that I might want to mention too is there was one more lady that was missed in your discussion about, well-behaved women who should make history, and that's my wife, Linda. Well, that's true, but it is our 48th anniversary today, so. So, thank you all for attending tonight, and we'd like to see you next month, so we'll see you.